and a very, very, very warm welcome to the CSW66 event titled Feminist Alternatives for a Transformative COVID Economic Recovery. So whichever part of the world that you're joining us from today, I know it will be very early for some of you and certainly very late in the evening for others. Thank you very much for attending. So my name is Sophia Fange. I'm from the Gender and Development Network. If you're new to us, we are a UK-based network of international development organizations, academics, and individuals working on gender equality and women's rights within the context of international development. I also just want to take a minute to extend a warm welcome to our French and Spanish speaking attendees joining us today. So just to let you know as well that we have a live interpretation available for you. And to select that option, you can click the button labeled interpretation at the bottom of your screen and select either French or Spanish channels. So my colleague Eunice, if you can wave there, also from the Gender and Development Network, will be posting those instructions in both French and Spanish in the chat for you now. So great. With that, we're really very, very, very excited for you to be joining us today as we hope to share with you some of the learnings from our latest report on lessons for a feminist COVID economic recovery, which we've just released today, all of about 6 minutes ago, but a little bit more on that in a tiny bit. Before we get started, you will have all also noticed, hopefully, and consented to the fact that this event is being recorded. And just for transparency, the recording is going to be placed on the Gender and Development Network's website. So just to be mindful of that. Okay, so what can you expect as part of today's event? So if I can just share my screen with you or to show you. I hope you can see that now. Okay, yes. Great, perfect. Firstly, what we'll hope to cover with you is a little background about the report, which is the foundation of today's event. We'll then have a plenary session in which you'll get the chance to hear from some of the brilliant authors of the report on which this event is based. And that report draws on women's real life experiences in Argentina, in India, the Philippines, and Uganda. Our speakers will provide, hopefully, a snapshot in the small amount of time that they've been provided of some of the policy measures enacted by governments in their respective countries in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts of those policies on gender equality and women's economic rights. So after that plenary session, that will be followed by a Q&A in which you can pose your questions to our speakers before we finally conclude today's session. And as I mentioned before, the event accompanies the release of our report today titled Lessons for a Feminist COVID-19 Economic Recovery, Multi-Country Perspectives. And my lovely colleague Eunice again will be placing the link to that report into the chat box. So once the event has concluded today, please do read it, please do share it. And if you are using social media today as well, as part of today's event, we encourage you to use the hashtag Feminist Economic Alternatives Work, and all of those details will be placed in the chat box now for you to access the report, tweet the report, as well as to use the relevant hashtag for it. So with that, before we finally officially get started, Eunice will share a few guidelines for us just to ensure that their event is a safe, as secure and respectful place. So Eunice, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. So yes, we have a few guiding principles for today's event that we would all ask you to adhere to. First of all, we would ask you to please place your speaker on mute until we get to the plenary session, just to ensure that there's no mic backlog and we can hear the speakers well. Then we would also ask you to please switch to speaker view so that you can see all the presentations and also see the speakers clearly. Then we would ask you, if you use the chat function, then we would kindly ask you to please also be respectful, not use any profanities or exclusionary or offensive language. And lastly, we want to say that we are not going to tolerate any harassment or intimidation of any kind towards the speakers or other attendees, so please be kind and respectful. Thank you, Sophie, and back to you.
Thanks very much, Rowena. Okay, great. So just before we get to hear from our brilliant speakers, we've got a lineup of 4 great speakers for you today. Just a little background about the report on which the event is based and on which the speakers will be talking about. So I think it goes without saying that COVID-19 has intensified long-standing inequalities. That has almost at this point become a universally accepted truth. And we've seen feminists from around the world, as well as women's rights organizations, actively documenting the ways in which women, particularly those who face intersecting forms of oppression, have borne some of the greatest impacts of the pandemic. So what we were keen to better understand through this report and through this work was, firstly, how governments were responding to the really dire economic inequalities that we were seeing caused by COVID, and which, as I mentioned just now, which had been documented by feminists and women's rights organizations, but also what were the impacts of those government policy responses on both gender equality and women's economic rights? And were there really any common lessons and good practices that could be shared from those experiences? So taking that into consideration, we were really fortunate enough to work with feminists and women's rights organizations in 4 countries, as I mentioned before, Argentina, India, the Philippines, and Uganda, to try and get some answers to these questions. So we just as really briefly for background, we chose these 4 countries largely in part because they represent different regions of the world with the aim of trying to find different experiences or uncover the different kinds of ways in which the COVID pandemic and government policy responses had impacted women in all those various regions. But also they all represented varying levels of national income, population sizes, but also needless to add here that we were very fortunate enough to have authors who had the capacity to undertake the kind of work that we were looking to do in the middle of a really massive global pandemic. So we thank our authors for that. And so with that said, through the report, we've sought to do 2 main things. Through the work of our 4 authors, what the report tries to do and what their learnings will try and highlight is the real life experiences and accounts of women who have really suffered some of the greatest ills at the hands of the pandemic. So from women working in the informal sector to domestic workers, community care workers, trade union leaders, and a whole host of others, the authors, today's authors, have spoken to and got the experiences of a variety of different of women to really get a better understanding of how COVID has played out in their real life context. But also using the experiences of these 4 countries alongside feminist propositions from across the world, what the report also looks to do is move us from further critiques of the problems caused by COVID-19 to propositions. And what it looks to do is develop a set of concrete recommendations for transformative COVID economic recovery. So we'll now get that chance then to hear from our 4 speakers who'll be sharing their insights from those 4 countries profiled in the report. And our 4 speakers and authors are first and foremost Rowena Laguilles-Timog from the Philippines. We've got Eunice Musiime from Uganda, Eleonor Faur from Argentina, and Mirai Chatterjee from India. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to present, and they've been asked to just really provide a brief background about their country's socioeconomic context and political context leading up to the pandemic, and also just briefly to explain the impacts of the pandemic on women's economic rights, and just some brief examples of how their governments responded to the pandemic and what the impacts of those government responses have been on women's economic rights and gender equality. And as I mentioned at the start, there will be an opportunity at the end of this plenary session to ask your questions. So please do have those whirring around in your mind in advance of the Q&A session. So I can now introduce our first speaker. As I mentioned, that will be Rowena Laguilles-Timog from the Philippines. Rowena is an assistant professor in the Department of Women and Development Studies at the University of the Philippines. And with that, I hand over to you, Rowena.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'll be presenting now the case from the Philippines. May I please get a chance to share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to now. Let me know if it doesn't work.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so 10 minutes. All right. This is also to inform everyone that the period of study for this presentation, as well as the report, had been from the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 until the near end of 2021. So we all know a lot of changes had also already come after that, but yeah, just to contextualize this presentation. Okay, so the Philippine context leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, our country really, from a macro perspective, still has a very neoliberal economic policies. No, a lot of our development policies, programs, and interventions are based on this, neoliberal belief that it is the private sector that will really push development, and that the government should, of course, act as more as a facilitator, for this development to happen. More distinctly as well, during the last few years leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, the administration in the Philippines had been very populist in its political style, creating divisions among the populations in the Philippines, for example, particularly through this program called the War on Drugs, which actually targeted drug users from poor communities. So this also created a culture or climate of fear within the country, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so a third situation I'd like to highlight, even before the pandemic, was the human rights violations happening in the country. And also, let me also say, that feminists and other human rights defenders and activists have called out this current administration's decisions and actions, particularly for being anti-poor, anti-people, and sexist, and for being sexist and misogynist, actually. So there is that opposition going on, despite all this very overwhelming political situation. Now, I would also like to say that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, gender situations have not been rosy in the Philippines, despite our positive stand in the international ratings and such. So, for instance, while women have a higher illiteracy and enrollment rates than men, there is still a lower population, of women who are in the labor force compared to men. And women, while they are de facto leaders in their homes, in their communities, and even in the world of work, they still comprise a fraction of elective positions in the country. Violence against women also persists in many forms, in varying, even in new forms, such as cyber violence, and more or less, I could say, that the situation stayed the same or worsened from during the pandemic time, Okay. The government approach to the pandemic can be summarized as the following. It's really focused on delaying the spread of the infection and restarting the economy over ensuring people's safety and quality of life. I'll go into better details later when I cite policies. Secondly, it depends greatly on loans and on the private sector for its pandemic response. This is consistent with the neoliberal perspective of the government when it comes to development. Third, it glosses over the scale and the urgency of people's survival needs. There had been a time when everyone was really not just in a state of panic, but also confusion over what the government is already doing about this pandemic. And even now, even until now, no, we still have these questions. How exactly or how effective exactly are all these responses getting? Okay, and fourth, of course, the government approach is not really surprising, but it renders the care work that had been holding families and communities together, especially during the pandemic, invisible or unimportant. There's no regard for that in the policies, for instance. Fifth, it misses, rejects, or opposes people's initiatives as opportunities for rebuilding or reshaping the economy. There were efforts from grassroots communities which when they reached the attention of the public, for example, would be met with criticism from the government itself or the administration in particular, such as from very simple efforts like community pantries, or even independent efforts by government officials themselves that seem to be more effective than the national response. Six, human rights were hardly considered. There's no framing regarding human rights. There's no human rights framing when approaching the pandemic. And then, in fact, it continues to be violated. On top of issues with implementation of the policies, the war on drugs also continued during the pandemic time. Sample policies are our Bayanihan one, which if you would be able to just glance at the slide, you would see how it really focused on providing emergency cash relief, usually around 100 to 200 USD for different sectors. The same approach or response can be seen in the second version of the policy. The focus is mainly providing cash relief there. Of course, there are contentions about the value of the amount, or rather the feasibility and how appropriate that amount is given the daily cost of living, for example, and the length of time that the pandemic had gone. Okay, some of women's experiences with these responses are as follows. This is an attempt to summarize all that we were able to find out through primary and secondary data. First of all, the relief assistance packages are inadequate given the inflation in the country, the extent of the lockdown. We're known to have one of the most extensive lockdowns, and the actual cost of living. And they also remained, the relief assistance packages themselves also remain inaccessible to some sectors of society, such as those who are not recognized as workers, and particularly in one of our cases among farmers and agricultural workers. Secondly, access to information regarding available relief assistance is uneven at best. This means that some deserving or qualified individuals or households weren't actually able to enjoy those benefits. Secondly, and also on that point, the information about these programs had also been confusing. They were interpreted differently across various levels of the government, and the availment processes can be very costly and confusing. And also, relief has been delayed. There would be national announcements that the budget had already been released, and so people would be expecting to be able to avail of them, but it would sometimes take months before they would actually receive the cash. There are those instances. Third, this sense of investing in people's health had always taken a backseat to opening up the economy. There seems to be a false opposition between them. And this caused a continuing cycle of easing mobility restrictions when COVID-19 cases would go down, and imposing lockdowns when cases go up. This means that when the economy does open up, there are no effective safeguards in place, right, for the workers and for the public in general. And lastly, I would like to point out that there has been more unpaid care work, particularly given the home-based schooling. This policy on home-based schooling is a result of the lockdowns themselves. Of course, when we say lockdown, all the institutions, social institutions had been locked down, and schools in particular had to be closed down. Okay, last slide. So some impacts, I tried to separate those impacts which I think were more long-lasting when it comes to women's situations. So first of all, pre-pandemic issues for women workers worsened generally, and were further neglected, whether we're talking about industry-specific issues or realities that every woman can experience, such as increased unpaid care work. Secondly, there are also stories about women being at a greater risk to COVID-19 infection, given their greater participation in the service industries as frontliners, especially in the health industry. The global reality of the majority of women being the ones who are at the health industry, such as being nurses, is also true in the Philippines. Third point, lockdowns have also caused, of course, massive job and livelihood losses. And even those who are in the informal economy, particularly given inflation in the country, this was the reality. And so this would result in reduced incomes, but also increased spending. Fourth, there's difficulty with access to government services because, of course, there's income loss, limited transportation options, and protocols also on office shutdowns, so that when government centers, when someone from the government centers gets infected, the entire office needs to be shut down, so it can't function to serve the rest of the community, for example. Fifth, there was a noted increase in teenage pregnancy, but also in maternal mortality. This relates to the availability and effectiveness of our healthcare system. And number six, there had been an increased vulnerability to domestic violence during the lockdowns. And lastly, there's this intensified role of women leaders and organizations to work for and with marginalized communities. That's where my presentation ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Wang, for that, or Rowena, sorry, for that absolute masterclass. That was a really brilliant presentation, going through all of the various stages of pre-pandemic, what happened during the pandemic, the government responses, and then what the impacts have been. That was very, very helpful. Thank you so much. And I hope that we'll be able to hear from the experiences of the other authors from the other three countries, where I think hopefully for our audience, you'll see many of the same kind of recurring patterns. So with that, I will hand over to our next speaker, who is Eunice Musiime from Uganda, who will be representing the Uganda case study. She is the Executive Director of Akina Mama Wa Africa. So over to you, Eunice, 10 minutes. And just a reminder as well, if you can, to speak as slowly as possible for the benefit of the interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Yamina. And you rightly say so, Sophie. We could easily just change Yamina's presentation, and that's Uganda as well. So it's the same context. But yes, thank you for the opportunity to present the Uganda case study. Next slide. So in terms of background and context, many actors have opined that COVID-19 was a revealer, but we could ask the question, to who and to whom was COVID-19 a revealer? Because we know that many of our governments actually know that the current neoliberal macroeconomic policies are not working, but then they have opted to take a different standpoint. And so for us in Uganda, two scenarios present themselves, interpreting the change, but then also looking at the intersection with gender dynamics. So in terms of interpreting the change in neoliberal Uganda, Uganda has been paraded as a success story. I want to quote a statement that was made by Christine Lagarde, who was the IMF managing director in Uganda in 2017. As she opened a meeting, she stated that this gathering provides an opportunity to congratulate Uganda for its impressive economic achievements and to speak about the possibilities of the future. She stated that she does not normally begin her speeches with statistics, but that day was an exception because she wanted to note that Uganda has grown threefold in terms of increasing its per capita income over the past generation. And I raise this point because it's important for us to look at how the metrics that are being used in a neoliberal context are the problem, are quite faulty. But then, so because of that, Uganda has been paraded as a success story, looking at its GDP growth and other metrics that the World Bank and the IMF often quote. But then the COVID pandemic then showed us that this did not stand. So it's important to juxtapose the neoliberal context together with the lived realities of Uganda, of Ugandans, whom Fanon referred to as the wretched of the earth, because that impressive economic progress oftentimes is not felt on the ground. And so COVID-19 then showed us that all these statistics that we like to quote and parade are really not the lived experience of majority of Ugandans, and so much so for women. Next slide. Oh, yes. So in terms of juxtaposing that with the gendered impact then, I would say that Uganda has put in place legal and policy frameworks that seek to promote women's rights. So we've signed and ratified all these international instruments, but the progress in terms of transforming social norms has been so slow. So patriarchy as a system remains deeply entrenched in the political, economic, and social spheres of life. And so that's why, even when the pandemic hit, it was clear that women were going to be the most disproportionately affected. So what did COVID-19 once again show us? It showed us the precarity of women's jobs and livelihoods. Women in Uganda, as we know, are overrepresented in the informal sector. So in markets, in trade, in service industries. And there is a picture of women who had to sleep in the market to be able to fend for themselves, to keep a level of, to keep some level of income to be able to sustain their lives. So they had to sleep in the markets. Right where they are selling their food, that's where they had to sleep with no sanitary conditions that are conducive, etc. And that again revealed to us how precarious women's jobs are. So to conclude on the precarity of women's jobs, it's safe for most women and girls is that they are either underemployed or unemployable. And so as we think about recommendations going forward, it's to think about how we transform the informal sector so that women's jobs can be more secure, they can be decent, and that they can earn a certain level of living wage. Next slide. Before I move to the fiscal support that was presented by government, I would like to state that Uganda too had the longest closure of schools, despite the lockdown itself being opened at certain points or closed when the cases would go high. We had the longest closure of schools, and so that led as well to violence against women and girls going high, skyrocketing numbers of teenage pregnancies, and that too was coupled with shrinking civic space, like Yamina has talked about in the Philippines. Democracy was in reversal, so there was no space for action. And so even when the packages that were being proposed by government were not gender responsive. There was no space for feminist groups or for women rights groups to even push back or counterbalance the proposals. And so in the end, we have fiscal policies that we know were not functional. So at the beginning of the lockdown, the government of Uganda opted for relief packages to the urban poor in the form of food, really basic food, which is posho, rice, and beans. And the coverage was not that extensive. So many, majority of Ugandan, even the urban poor, were left out. But then it did not even reach the rural areas who were equally in need of this support. But later on, the government switched and decided to give cash relief of not significant amounts. So like Yamina has said, the amounts were not significant and were not able to lead to any substantial relief for the recipients. And again, they were also riddled with corruption, who got what they got, etc. So that was in terms of social protection and relief packages. But then also the government went ahead to provide stimulus packages for businesses to be able to recover from the impacts of the pandemic. The stimulus packages, as we expected, were not gender responsive. The threshold was quite high for most women-owned businesses, but also due to the systemic and structural issues, the women-owned businesses were automatically left out of the criteria that was provided for them to be able to access the stimulus package. And these include the need for collateral. We know that not many women would have collateral. In Uganda, we have about 17% owning registered land. And registered land most times is the collateral that the banks require in terms of accessing loans. But then women businesses are also not really registered. They do not have registration numbers. They do not have bank accounts. They do not have business plans, etc. So all that worked automatically to leave them out of the stimulus packages. And then the sort of loans that were available, the threshold was on average USD 27,000, which for most women, that's not the kind of money that that's not the kind of money that flows through their businesses. Next slide. So why the stimulus package did not deliver is one needed a business plan and all other documentation that lays out the feasibility and viability of the business. Then the business had to demonstrate that it's contributing to an expected development impact, such as job creation, tax revenue generation, import substitution. And we know that most women-owned businesses are not necessarily designed in such a way. So the design of the package was already faulty. Then the business had to have collateral, like I had said already. And then the business itself had to contribute to its own equity between 10% to 60%. And remember, this is now a pandemic where the resources for the business had been wiped up in terms of taking care of the families during lockdown. And so the businesses were not really able to provide its own equity. Next slide. So the situation is also coupled with the fact that government had to get loans. Like Yamina has said, this is in consonance with neoliberal policies. The government of Uganda had to get loans to be able to respond to the pandemic. And what that meant is that the debt to GDP ratio rose quite high. And this indeed led to austerity measures being put in place. And we know that austerity measures disproportionately then impact on women who are reliant on public services for their survival. And so An example is where in Uganda, the government announced health budget cuts amidst the pandemic. It was the most unformable preposition. And there in the caption, it's not quite clear. Akina Mama, together with other actors, held a press conference where it called upon the government and just reminded the government that this is not the time for Uganda to have a health budget cut. But then, despite the activism, the government did not relent on its proposals, and also because it really has a high debt burden. So in terms of recommendations, it's also to think about what debt actually means for these governments in Africa. Next slide.
And Eunice, your 1 minute reminder.
Oh, okay. This is my last slide. So in terms of recommendations, of course, we know that structural and systemic transformation will not happen overnight. This is one of the statements that the government and other actors often say to us as feminists. They're like, oh yeah, the things you're proposing, they will not happen overnight. But what we need are concrete building blocks towards that structural and systemic transformation. And that's the only way we can build transformatively going forward. So what that may require, some of the thoughts to think about is promotion of rights of women in the informal sector. What does it mean? I know that transforming the informal sector takes time, but then we need to begin at that very basic level where we promote the rights of women. So really think about social protection, decent work, social security for women in the informal sector as a way of beginning to transform their livelihoods. Then, of course, as already stated, putting care at the center of recovery. We saw that during the pandemic, unpaid care work doubled in a number of countries. So this is the time to make the case for ensuring that care is at the center of the pandemic. Then, as has been stated severally, expanding social protection, because the crises that we are experiencing, not just COVID pandemic, has shown us that we really need to have a workable social protection system in place. Of course, also thinking about progressive tax policies to ensure that the wealthiest people contribute the most and not necessarily tax those who are at the bottom of the base. There's also an issue around accountability, given that the issue of shrinking space cuts across globally. There's also need to ensure that we have strong and well-resourced CSOs that are vital for counterbalancing state and market power, and bringing also historically excluded groups into decision-making. An assessment of most of the task forces that were set up to respond to COVID-19 showed that women were still grossly underrepresented, and not just women, but women in different diversities. Minoritized groups were not at all represented. And while we do speak about shrinking space for feminists, the space has been closed for certain categories of women. And so that's something also to really think about. And then finally, thinking about where I started, the impressive success story of Uganda's economic status, it's time that we really pushed hard on the genuine progress indicator as a promising approach that seeks to ensure that we are not just measuring GDP, which erases so many metrics from the picture, but begin to ask governments to use the genuine progress indicator as a measure that would show us that we are actually achieving true transformation. So I would end by saying all this requires an intersectional approach. So we need to foment gender justice, social justice, and climate justice. And the three is what is going to ensure that we have the kind of economic recovery that we are hoping for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eunice, for that very comprehensive presentation. And I think for a lot of our members of our audience, you will already begin to see a lot of the similarities between two very different countries, Uganda and the Philippines, from what Eunice and Rowena earlier shared. And I think that image of the women sleeping in the markets as a way to, in the height of the pandemic, exposing themselves to COVID and all other kinds of infections. I think that image is such an important one and that resonates and really highlights the ways in which of the experiences, the real life experiences of how many women have had to contend with the pandemic and its consequences. So thank you very much for that, Eunice. So next, we will be moving on to our next speaker, who is Eleonor Faur. Eleonor is a professor at the National University of San Martin in Argentina, and a researcher at the Institute for Economic and Social Development, also in Argentina. I know that Eleonor has had a few troubles with her internet this morning, so I just want to check that Eleonor, you are still with us at the moment. Yes, you are. You're there. Great. We can see you.
Yes, Sophie, I'm here. I don't know how long it will last, but I'm here now. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Great, Eleonor. And Eleonor, if you need to switch off your camera to help with your bandwidth, that's fine. And we'll share your presentation now, Eleonor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Well, good evening to everyone. I'm going to share my findings of my research on care workers in Argentina. And the outline is that my colleagues previously presented. So let's see the slides so as to go to the next one. So the socio-economic and political context, please. Sophie.
Eleonor,
the socio-economic and political context in Argentina previous to the pandemic.
Eleonor, I think that the line is really poor. I don't know if it's just me that's struggling to hear. So I think the line is very poor. Maybe we can try again, Eleonor. But otherwise, what I might do is move us to Mirai, and then we can come back to you to see if the internet connection improves, if that's okay, Eleonor, because I think it's difficult to hear you. It's very fragmented.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's try that. So first and foremost, then, if that's okay, we'll come back to you if that's okay, Eleonor. We'll test the internet. And so, firstly, we can then first and foremost move on and then come back to Eleonor. So next we have Mirai Chatterjee from who is the chairperson of the SEWA Cooperative Federation and director of SEWA, who many of you will know, the Self-Employed Women's Association. And she is also the chairperson of the SEWA Cooperation Federation. So what I'll do, Mirai, I know that you have a presentation for us. I'll share your presentation, and then we can move on to you if that works, Mirai.
Thanks very much. That works fine, and thank you very much for inviting us here. I'm happy to represent SEBA, which is the Union of Informal Workers. 2.1 million informal workers in India, and also the SEVA Cooperative Federation, who I'm representing today as well. As we start, I just want to say that, as you said, Sophie, I'm really struck with the strong parallels between all of our countries. We are very different economies, political systems, but it's striking how the experiences, particularly of women and the poorest and most vulnerable in our countries, are so similar. So I will choose, therefore, to focus more on the world of work, which is mainly in the informal economy in India. Next, please. And as you can see, more than 93% of the workforce, I think the slide will, yeah, there we are. More than 90% of the total workforce in India, or upwards of 500 million workers, are informal. And as far as the female workforce, it's almost everybody, like my sister in the slide, who's manufacturing inland salt in the deserts of our state of Gujarat. But these women are extremely economically active, and the informal economy as a whole, as you can see from the slide, is responsible for more than 50% of India's GDP and growth story, a big chunk of our national savings and exports. And I think it would be fair to say that our government recognizes the enormity of the informal economy and how critical it is. And this has been brought home during the pandemic as well. So we do have some policies, we do have some laws for the informal workers, some welfare measures as well. An example of a law would be the law for street vendors, which was perhaps the first of its kind in the world, protecting the livelihood of street vendors, many of whom are women, and also a similar law on social protection. But unfortunately, for the most part, informal workers are left to their own devices and to their own means of survival. And implementation, as I think is the case in many of our countries of the global south, is uneven at best. And in many cases, there's very poor implementation of laws and policies that are meant for informal workers, and especially women. Next, please. I have a slide here on the nature and characteristics of the informal economy. And this again would be, my guess is very similar for our sisters in the Philippines, Uganda, and elsewhere. Our sisters are characterized by very little work and income security, social security, no sick leave, maternity leave, very little childcare. As I've already mentioned, few laws and even poorer enforcement. Large segment of our workforce are purely self-employed, like street vendors and artisans. The largest chunk, of course, being small and marginal farmers in India. And of course, women were uncounted, undercounted, undervalued. Often they themselves undervalue themselves. When we start organizing workers, women workers, and we ask them, what do you do? They usually say nothing. And then we do an audit of their day, and they begin to understand how critical they are to the economy and the society in India. And obviously, there is an overlap between informality, poverty, and gender. And informal women workers are generally from the most disadvantaged and vulnerable castes and communities in India, like minorities. So this is part of the reality of the world of informal work. Next, please. This is about SEVA, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a national trade union. And we are spread across 18 states of India. At this time, we are celebrating 50 years of SEVA, set up in 1972 by Ila Bhatt, a labor organizer and lawyer. We are inspired with the values of Mahatma Gandhi, which include obviously truth and nonviolence, but also inclusivity, including people of all faiths and communities, and the poorest and most vulnerable, who of course are the women of our countries. We have been organizing women through the joint action of union and cooperatives for the last 5 decades, but we are also a movement of self-employed workers, informal workers, and we also see ourselves as a confluence of 3 movements: the women's movement in India, the labor movement, the cooperative movement, and something more. And today I'll be speaking a little bit more on the SEVA Cooperative Federation, which both is involved in action supporting cooperatives and also generating data through research and throughout the pandemic. Next, please. So the SEVA Cooperative Federation is an enterprise support system. We actively support women's collective enterprises like cooperatives. And as you can see, over the 30 years of our existence, and by the way, we are also registered as a cooperative ourselves, we have 110 cooperatives that have been promoted and are affiliated with the Federation, and about 300,000 women have been impacted in 6 sectors of work, including the core sectors in India like agriculture, handicraft, services, labor, savings and credit, and so on. Through this women's enterprise system, enterprise support system rather, we are engaged in capacity building, business development, market linkages, and so on. And of course, as I mentioned, research and policy action. Next, please. One of the things we were able to do during the COVID pandemic period, and like all of you have mentioned, India is also a country that suffered terribly. The second wave in particular caused huge loss of life, and we're still recovering from that shock, leave alone the loss of our livelihoods and our loved ones and continued illness. As you can see from our studies, more than 70% of women lost their livelihoods and 65% reported a reduction in income. Other studies of ours, including on childcare, have reported that 85% of women said they were not able to get back to work because they did not have access to childcare. Like has been mentioned by the earlier panelists, children were at home and women had to stay home and take care of them, in addition to all the other activities and economic activities that women undertake. So these are some of the main findings. I'll not read them all in the interest of time, but there were sector level impacts as well. There was a lot of, in the early stages, spoiling of crops, distress sales. In the service sector particularly suffered terribly. Domestic workers lost work and were not able to get back after months and months only, and fairly recently, they're beginning to get back on their feet. And so also for the manufacturing and handicraft sector, orders were cancelled, raw materials and supply chains were disrupted, all the kinds of things which I'm sure are familiar to our sisters in our other countries of the global south and north. And the financial sector, our savings and credit cooperatives also began to report some risk of defaulters naturally, even though women as best as they could and as quickly as they could try to repay their loans. Next, please. I think one of the major points I'd like to stress is that during this very difficult time, perhaps the most challenging time that most of us have ever faced, and certainly that India as a nation has ever faced since our independence 75 years ago, was that women led from the front. And I think in this, there are several lessons for all of us. Livelihood support was provided. They negotiated with employers who work with our domestic workers cooperative, so that domestic workers at least got some continuation of their salaries. Food was distributed. A special COVID insurance policy was developed by our insurance cooperative and extended to frontline workers, all of whom were women. And also a lot of awareness through digital tools, use of WhatsApp, SMS, and so on. Next, please. Women again were second to none when it came to emergency response. Their men folks said, stay home. It's risky for you. It's risky for the entire family, for the community. But they were out there in the front lines, providing healthcare, providing health kits, providing basic social protection, providing some basic working capital so that the enterprises survived the pandemic. And importantly, because we've always been a hungry country, providing food so that hunger and starvation was prevented. These are small efforts, but they were recognized, as you can see, by the World Economic Forum as well. You might wonder, what has the Indian government been doing? And I'll come to that a little later, but I've stressed more on what the citizens of our country did, particularly the women of our country. Next, please. Some more of the actions taken. These are women who had very little digital literacy. So digital literacy and digital training was taken up on a big scale. And it was exciting to see women who had very moderate literacy levels adapting very quickly to the use of digital tools. I've already mentioned the provision of working capital and seed capital, which was flexible financing. And we have found that the small amounts, 5 lakhs is 500,000 rupees, or just about 6,000 US dollars, is what helped thousands of families stay afloat, because they could buy seeds and other inputs at the proper time in the crop season. And as I've mentioned already, financial support and working capital. And here I should say that both private capital in India and overseas did step forward and provide this kind of support to artisans, women farmers, our health cooperative, and others. Yeah, before I go to the last slide, I'd like to share a little bit about what our government did. Of course, I should mention here that we have a federal structure. India has often been described as many little countries. It's a country with 1.3 billion people of different faiths, of different ethnicities, linguistic groups. Perhaps one of the most challenging nations on the earth to govern for so many reasons, which I don't have the time to go into. But I do think that our government did step forward on a couple of fronts. In particular, the public distribution system, which I believe presented an opportunity and prevented large-scale hunger and even starvation, because free food in terms of food grains was provided. Again, everything has to be with a little conditionality. I mean, the implementation is always uneven. Some states in India did better than other states. That's always the story of India. But food was provided, and that seems to have been critical, as can be seen in some of the recent election results in India, state election results, where people voted because they were pleased that government provided this kind of food security system. The government also provided cash transfers, very small amount, only 20 US dollars, which women always said was insufficient, but it was provided directly into the accounts of women, and many women were able to access these, and quite frankly, some were not for various reasons to do with the banking sector. Cash transfers in terms of pensions also reached a large number of our elderly population. The government, as you may have read in your countries from the news, also focused a lot on vaccination, because after we had this terrible second wave, we really sprung into action. And fortunately, India is a producer of vaccines and is even able to export to our sisters and brothers on the African continent and elsewhere. Government also provided loans to medium, small, and micro enterprises. But we felt as a federation of women cooperatives, tiny and nano women cooperatives, that they fell short. These did not reach the women that we work with. These reached generally cooperatives and enterprises run by men, and larger enterprises as well. So I think we would say, to be fair, that the approach of the government was mixed. Like we heard of our sister in the Philippines and in Uganda, they were slow to start off, but there have been greater investments in health, for example. But clearly, no one government in any continent has been able to match the challenge or even meet remotely the challenge of the pandemic, and our country was no exception to that rule. And my last slide would be on the way forward, because we believe that what women have shown are several paths to moving forward. I think the most important lesson that I would like to stress here, not just for the informal economy, of course for them, but for all, is the importance of organizing, the importance of building membership-based organizations like cooperatives. We knew that as a people's organization, but it has been underscored, not just for SEBA, but for all of us, because finally it was the citizens of this country, led by women in many places, who were able to not only provide emergency relief, but are also rebuilding bottom up from below with a focus on inclusivity, transparency, and accountability. And young people also have stepped forward, and many of them have formed their own collectives. In a country as huge and diverse as ours, the only way forward is a decentralized approach. It has to be bottom-up rebuilding with decision-making and control in local hands, and we would of course say in women's hands. We've also seen a lot of innovation and pivoting. Women who made exquisite handicraft products pivoted to making masks, and in that way, they were able to feed their families, they were able to work through their cooperatives. Then there's been an expansion to new sectors. A lot of young people now are very interested in digital, the digital economy and IT, and are forming their own IT groups and cooperatives and collectives. Investing in membership-based organizations like cooperatives. I had already mentioned earlier that these small infusions of capital were absolutely critical in the survival economy, and flexible financing. The kind of loans that government was providing, our members and our tiny enterprises said we're not in a position to take those kind of loans. So, we have to be imaginative, creative, consultative when we're helping people rebuild and build their resilience. Capacity building, we use this time not only for digital literacy, digital training, but exploring alternative livelihoods, technical and skill training, and supporting women to manage their own collective businesses. Digital literacy, I've already mentioned, but also it's been very important to note that there's been a significant digital divide, a gender digital divide. Most of the devices and tools have been in the hands of menfolk. That has to change. We have to invest in women's digital literacy and digital inclusion and infrastructure. And finally, as my sister from Uganda said, we feel strongly that it's now, we just cannot wait anymore. There has to be universal access to social protection, social security, universal healthcare, universal insurance, and universal childcare. 85% of women, as I said, were not able to get back to work because they didn't have access to childcare. And finally, if I may summarize, these kinds of women's enterprise support system and an ecosystem of collectives, cooperatives, and women's movements is what is enabling recovery, rebuilding, and resilience, not only for women's organizations and enterprises, but for their families, communities, and our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mirai, for that presentation, and a very comprehensive and thorough one for that matter. And again, very much to connect the dots with what both Rowena and Eunice have been documenting. And just to see, again, the parallels with some of the experiences, given the huge differences in the cultural differences, but also, as you mentioned, Mirai, the enormity of India, and I guess the different ways in which different parts of the government responded as well. But lots of similarities, I think, at the base of which is that women continue to be ignored, or women's experiences continue to be marginalized from economic decision-making or any decision-making for that matter. So I know that we've got Eleonor back on. I'm just going to see if we are able to, at this point, still connect with you, Eleonor. And as I mentioned previously, if there is, if it's helpful to remove your video to help with your bandwidth, that's perfectly fine. And we can share your presentation. So we can try that now if that's helpful, Eleonor. Can you hear us, Eleonor?
I think it might not work. I received an email from her saying if we can read out her presentation because the internet is acting up.
Well, that's a real shame, because there's so many brilliant lessons to share.
Oh, there she is,
from Argentina. Eleonor, can you hear us? I think she's vanished. Okay.
No.
she's not here. Okay, that's a real shame. So I think I'm not going to do it any justice by any means to kind of give you a running commentary of what happened in Argentina, largely because Eleonor has done such a brilliant job of summarizing it. The full details obviously are in the report itself, which we have provided a link for, but I think just some really top line things to share with you, also just to see how they connect with many of the experiences that our previous speakers have spoken about. So I think just generally speaking, with Argentina, many of you will know is a middle income country, which at the end of 2019 elected a new government. And the issue of care certainly has been recognized as a really central one for Argentina. And the care economy also initially at the start of the pandemic was one of the kind of central features of the Argentinian government's response, which really was very, very surprising to see from our perspective, just by comparison to everything that we have heard from the other speakers about the ways in which how poorly many governments responded. So to see how the Argentinian government prioritized care was really refreshing, at least initially. And one of the ways in which the Argentinian government centralized the issue of care was the formation of an interministerial committee on care policies, which was led by a Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity, which had just been set up when the new government had been elected at the end of 2019. And again, one of the very substantive ways in which there was an institutionalized response, institutionalized gendered response to the pandemic. And obviously, a big focus for this interministerial committee was a response package that tried to provide or included addressing emergency family income, as well as providing monthly support to informal workers and domestic workers, among others, who tend to have fallen, who would have otherwise fallen through the cracks without this very specific measure. But what we have seen in Argentina, as you will see with the report, is that as a result of a really poor election result in November 2021, where the government lost many seats, the issue of care then fell off the agenda altogether, which was really unfortunate, given that there was so much promise at the start in the Argentinian government's response to the pandemic, which had this really, really big focus on care. And especially, I think many of you will know, just historically with Argentina, it has a really, it has a really vibrant civil society, especially a strong feminist civil society. I think just before the current government had been put into place, the last administration had taken out an immense IMF loan, which had, I believe it was about $44 billion, which was the largest the world had ever seen. So at the same time as trying to combat the pandemic, you see that the Argentinian government also having to address many of these fiscal challenges with having to repay these huge kind of debts, which also inevitably have influenced the kind of measures that we have seen from the government. But certainly from the brilliant work that Eleonor has done as part of this research, which I really, really encourage you to read further on, is the ways in which we saw domestic workers, particularly community care workers in Argentina, immensely impacted by the pandemic because of the fact that domestic workers in particular account for almost about a fifth of Argentina's female labor force. And yet, of course, they experienced immense levels of job insecurity, particularly at the hands of their employers. And there were many, many job losses because of the consequences of COVID. And yet you see, again, how domestic workers in particular are not recognized as real workers by most of their employers, and the ways in which they suffered at the hands of many of their employers. And also in Argentina, there's a huge culture of community canteens and community kindergartens, which were largely grassroots safety nets, which had been developed by many of the communities themselves in response to historically insufficient state resources. And they too were having to fill many, many of the gaps that were the gaps in public services that were caused as a result of the pandemic. And Eleanor's case study really highlights the ways in which the women who were working in many of these canteens and in these community kindergartens were having to face the brunt, paying through their own, using their own resources to supplement food and caring services within their respective communities, but huge, overwhelming amounts of work that they had to take on to provide this gap in service provision, working extra hours without any pay, with very limited resources. So there's really lots of brilliant work that Eleanor's case study outlines, which I'm so sad that we haven't been able to hear from you, Eleanor, because it's such a helpful case study also to contrast with some of the others about what might have been a positive way forward potentially. But yes, as I said, I really highly recommend that you have a look through that case study and when you have a chance to. So with that being said, I now just want us to just really quickly pull together some of the key issues that we have seen highlighted from these case studies, some of the common experiences, which the panelists have already really helpfully helped to pull together. So if I can just share my screen with you, in a second, I can just highlight some of those common lessons. So as many of the speakers already highlighted, we've seen inadequate policy responses with uneven implementation and barriers to access in how governments have responded to the pandemic. Also highlighted was a failure to address the care economy or the needs of informal workers. And certainly this over-reliance on women's rights groups and community actors to fill in gaps in public services or public service provision, yet at the same time, a reluctance to include these very groups and other feminists in policy making. And generally also what our panelists, I think, alluded to, certainly from their presentations, was we have global macroeconomic policies currently in place that play a huge part in limiting government's policy choices, as well as the fiscal space that they have to be able to respond to many of the challenges that the pandemic has caused. And lastly, and this is just a snapshot of some of these common experiences, there certainly are others. What is clear is that these government responses, which focus on quick fixes, which is basically just trying to respond to the immediate challenges caused by COVID, without addressing existing long-standing inequalities, only serves to amplify and further entrench many of these inequalities. And if I may very quickly just point to the fact that the kind of key lesson for us from what we've seen from this report, from the experiences that our panelists have shared as well, is that we can see very much from these experiences and also connecting the dots with other work that feminists have done in terms of alternative approaches to economic recovery that have been put forward by others, is that we have concluded an overarching message is that a just and equitable COVID economic recovery must center the issue of care, well-being and sustainability with transformative policies that promote equity. And so this requires national, international decision makers and local decision makers to take the following actions, which is protecting and promoting democratic and participatory decision making, and really ensuring the participation of feminists and women's rights organizations so that their expertise of those who are most impacted can be at the front of policy responses. And this in turn provides the information and framework to apply intersectional feminist analyses in policymaking that center women's lived realities and experiences, but also, as I mentioned before, address these long-standing intersecting discriminations that they face. This in turn then will highlight the need to adopt alternative feminist economic proposals, ones that include progressive taxation to fund public services and social protection, but also to the recognition and redistribution of unpaid care and decent work with living wages and enforced labor protections. So I think it is, hopefully that has painted a helpful picture of trying to pull together all of the common experiences that were shared by our panelists, but also as a way of putting together all the amazing work that other feminists trade unionists, women's rights organizations, all the work that they have been doing to try and pull everything together as much as possible. So with that, I know that we have limited time left, but I wanted to open up the opportunity for others if you would now like to ask our panelists any questions. And if you would, you can please type your question in the chat box if you would prefer, or alternatively, you can use the raise hand option in the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen and put forward your questions. So I want to give everybody a minute to kind of think over if they have anything that they would like to ask of our panelists, anything that you would like to clarify, or any points that you found particularly interesting or that you would want to hear more about. Okay, great. So we've got a question or a comment from Elizabeth Klatzer. She says, thanks so much for these great presentations and work. The big challenge is on how to mobilize globally towards these alternative economic frameworks. Any input from the speakers on how to do this? A brilliant and massive question, Elizabeth, but a very welcome one. So I will pose that question to all three of our speakers. So perhaps Rowena, Eunice, and then Mirai.
Okay, thank you for that question. What comes to mind right now is the reality that feminists and women's rights organizations are already working at a global level to push for certain changes. And like Eunice pointed out, I remember her pointing this out most emphatically. These changes do not occur overnight. They're not instant, and it's helpful to appreciate how far, however far along we have to go. We've also already come far, no, from that point where women's issues are totally invisible. And so, me personally, I'm hopeful that we are actually moving forward, however slowly. But my point is that we do not have to start from scratch. We begin from where we are now, and that's by acknowledging that there are strong feminists and women's organizations who are already doing the work, and we, of course, the best that we can do is support them, be part of this movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rowena. Eunice, I'll come to you next.
Yes, thank you, Sophie, and thank you for the question. I like what Mirai said, that she represents the labor movement, the women's movement, the social justice movement, and I think it's time right now to merge those not to merge those movements, but to work strongly together across movements. So like I said earlier, the gender justice movement, the climate justice movement, the social justice movement, to work together towards ensuring that macroeconomic policies represent the kind of ideals and feminist alternatives that are required. And so it's really just to strengthen movement. But then the second issue I would raise is that resourcing for women's rights or feminist movements remains minimal. And so there's need for advocacy and pushback in terms of resourcing to ensure that the kind of work that needs to be done is actually supported, because we know that it's less than 1% that goes to resourcing the women's movement. That can never deliver much in terms of pushing back. Like we've said, we are pushing back on the power of corporates, we are pushing back on the power of markets. So that requires a little bit of resourcing for us to be able to organize adequately in terms of a global response to these macroeconomic frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eunice. Yes, that funding question, always a critical point. And Mirai, the same question to you.
Thanks, Sophie, Rowena, and Eunice, for this really interesting discussion. I think the first and foremost, as Eunice has just mentioned, is that we women have to organize harder and perhaps even faster across continents. It's happening, as Rowena mentioned, but I think we need to do this even more, because without our sisterhood, our solidarity, we will not have voice and representation at national level, leave alone the global level where these decisions are made. And in this, we have made a start. Many of you would be aware of the organization WeGo, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, a network of grassroots practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. And WeGo has given birth to 3 other important networks: StreetNet, street vendors across the world; HomeNet, the newest baby since February 21, HomeNet International, of home-based workers organizing collectively, and domestic workers also have their federation. And it's through these that we can begin to work together and influence macroeconomic policies and also hold our governments to account. All these are connected, as we know. And there's an opportunity this year at the International Labour Organization, where the social and solidarity economy is being seriously discussed. I think there is a greater sense, not just among all of us and the trade union and labor and cooperative women's movements, but also more generally, that we're in this together. The pandemic has brought that home. Climate change is bringing that home. I was surprised to see the emphasis in the World Bank on early childhood care, and not just from the perspective of children, of course that's important, but from the perspective of women's workforce participation. Similarly, the trade union federations like the International Trade Union Congress seriously taking up the issue of the care economy, and so also the International Cooperative Alliance. So there's several alliances, and of course, I just mentioned a handful. But I think it's a combination of our grassroots organizing and bringing voice and representation to these fora, which will make the difference. And finally, what we have been trying to say in our country, and I think also globally, we need to also hold the corporate sector to account. This is about all of us. It's about solidarity. It's about closing the huge inequality gap that has developed even further during the pandemic. And of course, as has been said, women are at the lowest end.
Oh, we just seem to have lost Mirai mid.
And gender discrimination. And so intersectionality is important.
Thank you, Mirai. And I think all of you make very, very, very solid, brilliant points. And I think also, Elizabeth, just to add to that, I think there's also that role or that consideration about what the role of Northern organizations is also in that, like, global mobilizing for this work. There's lots of brilliant work that's being done at the grassroots. And then the question obviously is, especially for Northern organizations like ourselves, how do we support that global mobilizing? How do we hold our governments to account? Is there, especially because they happen to be responsible for many of the challenges and problems that we see globally, especially in the North. But this is learning that we're also trying to develop as well at the Gender and Development Network, which hopefully we'll be able to share at some future point. And then we've got a final question before we wrap up, if that's okay, or final point from Julie. She says, thank you so much for the powerful presentations. Indeed, it's very enriching. This is Zonuiok tuning on all the way from Africa, CSW. Hello, CSW66, the Africa caucus. Hi there. Though my question is informed more by the presentation of Uganda. So for you, Eunice, I wish to know the study findings in terms of COVID-19 recovery. What are the innovations that governments have now put in place to accelerate the recovery? Eunice, is there anything that you're able to share on that, especially more updated information on ways in which the government, the Ugandan government, are accelerating recovery, if they have made any further measures in addition to what you had documented?
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for that question. I would say that further on, government has tried to put in place more gender responsive stimulus packages that can be able to meet women-owned businesses at their points of need, and also to loosen up in terms of the criteria that was provided. This funding is coming through the international financial institutions, And again, you can raise the question about how far and how much international financial institutions are going to ensure that actually the kind of resourcing is transformative. But again, like Mirai said, maybe we need to celebrate first the fact that this funding is being made available and the criteria is being loosened to allow women who would not necessarily be able to benefit from this sort of resourcing to benefit. So I think the way forward now is for that conversation around ensuring that the kind of funding that is available is adapted to meet the needs of women-owned businesses. So I would say that's the sort, that would be the update. And I would also say that there are still efforts to ensure that there's health sector strengthening, ensuring that there's insurance, national insurance coverage. So there are reforms that are being made in terms of social protection, and again, as a result of the pandemic. So I would say those are the two updates.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eunice, for that. And Julie, I would say as well, to have a read through the report to see just even some of the initial ways in which the governments, Ugandan government especially, responded. And just before we wrap up, just so that I can give our speakers just one more final point, very quickly, if I may ask you to, if there was a single recommendation that you think that you would like to pose to decision makers, especially in response to everything that we've seen about how governments have responded to the pandemic, is there any particular one that you might think to prioritize? And I will ask Rowena, Eunice, and Mirai in that order, if there was just one single recommendation.
That's a very difficult question.
A very difficult question. Is there one that you think that you might prioritize from your particular context that you think has perhaps the traction to be able to be executed, but is also a really enormous priority? It's a massive question. The answer might be no, that there isn't. But I thought I would ask.
If there was one, in our case in particular, I would go for really a shift in process, because only then will the concrete solutions that's already being done and that can be done will reach the policymaking level. So it's really a shift in process from the very top down and even authoritarian approach to a more bottom up participatory and really, an approach that surfaces the diversity of people's experiences, not just in terms of the problem, but again, the solution. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rowena. And Eunice?
I would say the same in terms of decision making. The research has shown that there was underrepresentation of women and minoritized groups in terms of decision making across all levels. And I think redressing that would help in terms of ensuring that feminist analysis is being integrated in all the conversations that are being had, because as we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, the response was quite gender blind. So having women as part of these processes, having minoritized groups as part of these processes would then, to an extent, be able to ensure that the alternatives that we are speaking about are considered and adopted.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eunice. And Mirai, finally you.
Thanks. A difficult one, I agree with my sisters, but I would recommend, we have been recommending, a livelihood restoration fund with social protection. So it has to be a holistic, integrated approach, putting livelihood, as Rowena said, bottom up in the hands of women so that they can come out of poverty and rebuild, but also some basic social protection like universal health care and childcare. These go together, they can't be separated. And if I may, I just want to stress that the networks that I mentioned, StreetNet, HomeNet, and the Domestic Workers Federation, now Waste Recyclers, all have sisters and brothers, well, mainly sisters, from the north and south. So sisterhood indeed is global.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mirai, and really great to hear a lot of the resonance across your responses, especially on the need to center lived experiences and women's voices, particularly taking into consideration the broader the care economy as a response to many of the ills and challenges that we're seeing that COVID has raised. So thank you to everybody for attending today's session. I'm really, really, really thankful for all of you who have made the time, especially as I can see in the chat box, Anjali, you've woken up at 4 a.m. to listen to this event, and we're very grateful that you made the time, and I'm glad that you found the event and the learnings from this event helpful, and I'm sure that the report itself will be particularly helpful as well. So my colleague Eunice has just again put the link to the report, the tweet with the report, as well as the hashtag for this event in the chat box. So if you would like to share the publication, put any thoughts and reflections that you might have about the report itself through your social media channels, please do. And again, that hashtag is Feminist Economic Alternatives Work, which we have clearly heard our brilliant speakers say today. So I just want to extend a massive, massive thank you to all three of our speakers who are here today, but also Eleonor, certainly, who has, because of the internet challenges, she has not been able to join us, but her findings certainly are in the report. So thank you, Rowena, thank you, Eunice, thank you, Mirai, for taking the time, and also to not only to be here, but to also for all the work that you and your teams have put into developing this report. We thank you immensely for your time and for all of the efforts that you have put in pulling together the findings, and certainly to all the women that you also interviewed as part of your research. We are immensely grateful. So with that, we come to the end of this event. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Take care. Bye.